request all the panelists to join for a panel discussion. This is a very fascinating. Please unmute yourself, Manish, Meg. Yes. So we sort of had a conference in two sections. The first section was about distortion, about Hindu thought and history, and the second section is appropriation. So in a way, this your concluding remarks in your book is about appropriation, colonial, or you call it colonial appropriation. So it's a very interesting thing. I request the panelists to say a few words about the event and chime in. Jaideep, Kundan, yes.
No, thank you for putting this together. Because this is important. People who have been involved with the study of the tradition in a scholarly fashion, and have been, blessed, by looking at both the Indian tradition as well as the Western treatment of the Indian traditions. Totally understand what's been going on. There are lots and lots of threads that have to be unraveled, and particularly the people who come from India, who have an understanding of the Indian tradition, have this clarity that the tradition through the Western intervention has been significantly distorted, and this distortion is actually having an impact on Indians also, because the Indians themselves have started looking at their own traditions through the Western lens because of the internalization of the colonization which have occurred. So in order to sort of recover the tradition and move forward, I think it will be very important to look at the distortion and the appropriation which have happened. In a certain sense, this process is also going to involve deconditioning of our own self, in order to understand what was there in place, early on, and then basically move from there. It's not about, the people who are involved with this, we are certainly not regressive. We are not looking backwards, but in order to look forward, I think it will be very important that we regress, just like what we do in psychotherapy. If you want your client to basically advance, then you have to make the client regress in order to progress.
Yeah.
And I think this will be something which will be important, for the representation of the Indian tradition, also for the damage that the Indian traditions have encountered because of Western intervention, that we will need to look at the distortions, we'll need to go back and move forward, basically transcend the binary of regress and progress. So that's the point that I wanted to make, and thank you very much for putting this panel together. Towards the end, I will have a question for Sophia, but I'll hold off that question.
Meg, do you have any closing comments?
Namaste all. It was wonderful to meet some people for the first time, and I thought it was a great opportunity for me to learn from the other panelists, because different panelists brought in different perspectives, and I'm really grateful to Indica for this opportunity to primarily learn and also to share some of my findings from my work. Thank you.
Thank you. Manish?
No, that's all. I concur with Meg. Thank you for organizing this. This was so important. And it was also a learning experience. And I wish more types of these conferences with similar themes can be done in future for other areas too. Thanks.
Thank you. Rajat?
Yes, I concur with Meg and Manish, what they have said. This has been a nice learning opportunity for me, meeting many people for the first time, also sharing my thoughts. It's, of course, without question that we look at the distortions which the Western Indologists have brought in, and we put our efforts in knowing ourselves, knowing our traditions, and so on. But another question which is just coming to my mind is, suppose we want to know other cultures. Now, what do we do? Right? I mean, our academia, I don't know if they're doing that much work. They're not even invested enough time and effort in understanding our culture. What about other civilizations? If this is the scholarship which these people are coming with, how do we trust them on other civilizations? So that thought just cropped up. So
Yes. I'll segue into Joy and ask his comments, and also perhaps he can respond. Conrad. Hi.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, but we can't see you. We would like to see you.
Yeah, right, because I'm behind the wheel.
Okay. Okay. Well, do you have any comments?
Well, first, a very personal comment. I am very happy that Glastonbury was mentioned here. Glastonbury is indeed a sort of place of pilgrimage. As a young hippie, I used to go there many times. And we used to sleep on the Tor. The Tor is a hill with a tower built on top of it, the leftover of an abbey. And if you sleep there, you're supposed to hear a heartbeat, because Merlin, the wizard, the friend of King Arthur, has been buried there. So that's great. That's our own little kind of spirituality. As for Buddhism, well, let me just say that I'm quite optimistic, especially hearing all this detailed knowledge, especially the refutation of what Bronkhorst has done, has been very advanced, very detailed, and I am quite happy about it, because we have to continue this. This is enticing way too many people, so we have to stop it. But otherwise, and also in light of what Sophia just said, the normalization of Buddhism in the West is going on at a good speed. And so, of course, you see, there are many funny childhood diseases that you guys probably smile about. But, over the course of my life, I've seen it evolve in a more mature direction. So I guess what will happen in the West is about what has happened in China 2,000 years ago, when you see Buddhism got integrated. So that's what I see coming. Thank you.
Yeah, I see that too. In 2 generations, in all probability, our great-grandchildren will be Buddhists. So that is the way it is going. Sophia, do you have any response? Yeah, Manish, go ahead. Yeah. Maybe I can ask Joy to respond to Rajat and also give his concluding comments.
Let me share, actually, all the presentations are done. I recall later on when I was listening to the others, the source of the Don Lopez narrative that I cited. It's a paper called Indology, What is it good for? And look at the link that is being claimed here between Indology and the Enlightenment. Disciplines like Indology can only exist against a background of Enlightenment values. However, not only do disciplines like Indology need Enlightenment values also need disciplines like Indology. The two need each other, their dependence is reciprocal. The interesting thing that this article reveals, it's by Bronkhorst, which everyone here in this panel is familiar with his work. The insistence that Indology represents the values of an enlightened humanity is a totalizing claim that there is one set of common human values that all people have to subscribe to, irregardless of their particular tradition or background. Second, that only a discipline like Indology is able to reinforce those values. And the antithesis to Indology is to be not enlightened, to be reactionary, to be backward, to be conservative, to be right-wing. These are very big moves that are being made without even a modicum of evidence. And I think that has to be sort of attacked, to say that Indology does not represent the Enlightenment. Indology is like a medieval guild, or it is like the Catholic Church. It has powerful prelates. They're only concerned with their own privilege and authority. They have undone the Lutheran Reformation, in which they have come back between the people and the text, and now saying you cannot interpret the text, you cannot pick up a text or read it on your own. There can be no knowledge that circulates unless it goes through the circuits of Indology. We are now the ultimate arbiters and controllers of all textual practice. It is that anti-emancipatory, anti-Reformation, anti-Lutheran move which I think has to be critiqued in Indology. This is a priesthood. This is a highly corrupt priesthood, and that is why it finds itself in conflict. So I want to go to the appendix where you will see it recounts the Don Lopez story. Here is what he says. As an appendix, blah, 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 I will present to you a passage from a recent book that shows that the criteria of objective historical scholarship are among the hardest to accept by those who belong to religious traditions. Even religious traditions that declare themselves completely open to the results of modern science may hesitate to accept the results of modern historical scholarship. And then he says this is Tibetan Buddhism in the presence of the Dalai Lama. Again, traditions do not have a problem with modern science. Indology is not modern science, it's not modern, and it's not science, right? This should already be a revelatory moment where you see that traditions that Hinduism has worked perfectly well with the scientific worldview. It has worked perfectly well with technology. It does not have a problem with IT. It does not have a problem with modern medicine. The areas that it has a problem with turn out to be not scientific, but evangelical and Christian by derivation, and not universal, although they claim to be making a universal claim. And they want to enter these traditions, not just Hinduism, Buddhism. Every tradition in the world has suffered from the imposition of a Protestant hermeneutic on it. And what we are witnessing is really the rejection of that Protestant approach to sacred texts, which other cultures are also fighting off. So that's where I want to end. You cannot trust literature that goes through the university or the academic system always. Broncos, for example, everyone knows the thesis is, to put it politely, BS, but the thesis has a certain advantage. It keeps conferences going. It keeps money flowing. They say we have to get together and discuss this. Everyone knows that the thesis doesn't work, but something simplistic, historical, sort of tangible, that kind of thing is easy to market and sell, and to create a lot of host of papers responding to Broncos by people who don't have anything to say. So really it is the lowest common denominator that the academy appeals to. Okay, let me end there.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, Manish, yeah, go ahead.
Professor Bhakti, can I ask you one question? In that same paper, Bronkhorst has written, and this is a view of a lot of other scholars also, that modern traditions like Christianity or Hinduism are appropriators of ancient texts. So modern Hindus are appropriators of Mahabharata. How do you respond to that? You know, are we as modern citizens an appropriator of ancient civilization?
He's not saying we're appropriators of ancient civilization. What he's saying is that the Mahabharata does not belong to just the Hindus. It belongs to everyone, and anyone can come in and say what they wish to about it. And he's declaring this under the banner of Enlightenment values. Now, there's a problem with that. Texts belong to communities. They are written for communities, cared for community, by communities, preserved by communities. Communities organize their lives around texts. There's a very famous quote by Deleuze, which is known as the butt-fuck quote, where he says, if you do not love a text, you have no reason to read it. Everything else is just buggery. And he says that, you know, modern philosophy was a buggery of the ancients. I think that's a very, very legitimate perspective. It's one thing to say texts do not belong to a community, but if you dislike a text and you disparage a text, what gives you the authority then to enter and trample on that text? This is iconoclasm. And it was the problem really goes back to Christianity's vexed relationship with Judaism, because remember, In the words of John Levinson, Christianity is the only religion with the scripture of an alien religion in its midst. If Christianity did not make this claim that the Hebrew Bible doesn't belong to the Jews, we have the right to come in, reinterpret it, take it apart, dismantle it in the name of historical criticism, Christianity would cease to exist. And something similar is going on with Indology. I am not a racist in any way, shape, or form. Everyone can read every text. I don't even have the power to control people. But treat texts that you care about and love and that you get something out of. What is the point of reading a text to show that Black people wrote it? That's what Oldenburg does, right? He reads the text to say, look, clearly this has been written by Aboriginals and how stupid they are. This is just a race play. The humanities have to have a higher function than enabling a race play for an underclass of Germans. Oldenburg came from a Protestant pastor family, and it's that underclass that has underpinned a lot of the German university.
Yep.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd just like to add a line, if I may, Hariji.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So it's interesting, Joy, that you mentioned what you did and the article that you quoted from. The first footnote of the paper that I wrote for this conference included this. We have and this is Bronkhorst. We have a far more important role to play vis-a-vis to defend the Enlightenment values that we consider vital for the society we live in. So it's quite blatant in terms of the role that they see he sees himself playing, right? And it's almost like a binary conflict that needs to be that he needs to involve himself in. So it's interesting to hear your perspectives on this.
He was desperately trying to get an ERC, European Research Council grant. He wrote up a whole proposal to investigate what structures in the brain make us religious. Why do we have religion? I want to know what in our brains makes us responsible for religion. Now, this is a massive biologization of intellectual life. I mean, similarly, we could say, what in our brain makes us think we have Indology, right? What in our brain makes us respect professors? And can we please extract that portion of the brain or find a vaccine against it? But the way the question is being framed, that religion does not have intellectual, spiritual, ideal being, but it is simply a peculiar spark of the brain which Europeans have somehow cured and Indians have yet to learn how to cure. Or the Dalai Lama has to be cured of his false notions. This is problematic.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I have a question for Sophia. I want to know from you. You mentioned in your first section that how Foucault has also influenced you. The sensitivity for cultural appropriation that we see now in the US, that they are more cautious about cultural appropriation. Do you think that movement, the tailwind from that movement, will translate into respecting Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam, and ensuring that appropriation doesn't happen? That means, do you see the economic forces will prevail, the capitalist forces will prevail, or the tailwind from the CRT or the tailwind from the sensitization of appropriation, which will prevail? What do you see in 10 years' time? Because your book is come at a very right time.
Well, that's a really good question. I think that, there's a couple things. I think one of the things is that, people that are colonizers aren't really good at self-examination. So, right? So it's like, I'm a white scholar, obviously, but I try to be fairly conscious about my whiteness, my privilege, and, all that, which is one of the reasons I wrote the book. But I can't, say that that's the same for all white folks, right? It's mostly white folks that are doing this colonizing. I think that, the book has had a really good reception among academics. But I've, had a couple kind of people that are like the nuns that are kind of like these new age people that have really not liked the critiques of whiteness, right? And I think, I mean, one of the things about cultural appropriation is, of course, you have to have, some kind of self-reflection. You have to kind of understand your own privilege. I mean, there's only a small segment of the population of the US that even gets that. I mean, you can look at the election, right? The last election, you can kind of see like, well, maybe like some portion of one party gets that, but clearly the other party doesn't get that at all, right? About these kinds of issues of, white supremacy and white power. So, I mean, I think there's that problem. And then, of course, there's this huge force of capitalism. So, I mean, you have these, these corporations like Goop. So Goop is this company which was started by this actress, Gwyneth Paltrow. And it's now this like huge thing, right? And it makes all this money, and there's all these people that buy the stuff, right? That buy the stuff and whatever, does like $400 yoga pants or whatever they're buying. And, they're not doing any self-reflecting. And there's a lot of people like that. I mean, the Goop consumer is very wealthy. And then there's a lot of people that like think the Buddha's cool, right? And the Buddha's kind of this cool guy. And so they will buy their Buddha t-shirts or their Buddha skateboards or the Buddha towels or whatever, And so, I mean, I don't have like a lot of hope that a lot of people are going to be, I mean, the way the society's moving is we are seeing a little bit more consciousness about that kind of stuff. But I don't think it's enough to, to kind of stop the tide of capitalism. Right. And I mean, one of the problems with all this, of course, is that some of the ways in which Hinduism and Buddhism and Islam are appropriated are like deeply offensive, right? And violate the rules of the religion, or in terms of
we
like,
have
this, right?
In Texas, you have a concept of goat yoga, where they practice yoga on a farm with goats, yoga.
Right.
So these kind of things, beer yoga, goat yoga, you must have heard of those things.
Yeah.
So that's very offensive.
Yeah. And some of those are, mentioned, in my book. Now, I think one of the other things, to point out, and I have this chapter on Hinduism and Buddhism in my book, and then this separate chapter on Islam and Sufism, is that, a lot of North Americans, they don't really understand the difference between Hinduism and Buddhism. Like they don't like have a good, I mean, there's not great religious literacy, right? In North America. And I mean, I teach at a public university. Most of my students are first generation students. And they're, thirsty for knowledge. And I mean, I have a lot of students that come in my class that, really have no concept of Hindu. I mean, they don't know anything about Hinduism until they take my world religions class, right? They don't know the first thing. And they're not unusual. Like they're not that much different than students. I mean, I live in Kentucky, but they could live in Massachusetts and not know anything, you know what I'm saying? So, I mean, there's those kinds of, issues too, right? And part of that, I do think, is geography. I mean, I do, the US is very isolated geographically. I think Europeans are, a little bit more with it about this kind of stuff. And then the other, part of it is just the low numbers of other religions in this country. I mean, we have like very low single digits of Muslims in the US and, other religions that aren't Christianity, right? And so, and I will tell you that even my Christian students, who are almost all Protestant, they know nothing about early Christianity. So when we study, we do the Christianity unit in world religions, I mostly do early Christianity. So, what they would consider the Catholic tradition. They often talk about the Catholic, they'll say something like, well, I'm not Catholic, I'm Christian. These kinds of comments, like they just don't know anything about that. And so it's even about their own tradition. And that's not unusual at all, and so we're also kind of dealing with those sorts of issues about, so when somebody, who is kind of a religious dabbler, like they're going to do Buddhism for a while, and then they think they're going to do Hinduism or yoga for a while, and then they're going to go on and do some Sufi thing for a while. They don't even really know a lot of the time what they're doing, right? I mean, they don't know the first thing. And so that's, one of the problems is that we're dealing with people that are really just consumers, and the way that these things are marketed is to kind of appeal to this thirst for spiritual experience. And so that's kind of why there's that appeal, right? And there's this question that's kind of related to this. There was a question in the Q&A about the West is usually very strict about plagiarism in academic trade circles in terms of both texts and ideas. However, the strict regime does not seem to exist even in academic circles when it comes to the appropriation without attribution of Hindu and Buddhist practice and concepts. So I don't know of examples of that. I can tell you that, like there's some really good work on, this has been mentioned before, but this kind of European Protestant bias in the study of religion, right? This is something that J.C. Smith wrote extensively about during his lifetime. And there's some really good focused studies on this. Richard King has done this incredible work on the problems of mysticism in the study of India. He has this great book on this. He's written specifically about Hinduism, specifically about Buddhism. There's a really nice article by Gregory Chopin called Protestant Presuppositions in the Study of Buddhism that I actually just had my students read this week. And one of the things that's about is how the kind of Protestant bias, right, the way that scholars think, which is shaped by the Enlightenment, shaped by the Reformation, caused all these problems in the early study of Buddhism. And I mean, scholars had no idea what they were doing. Like they were like the Buddha's from Africa, they didn't know, right? And one of the reasons they didn't know is because they only focused on texts, because there's a super hyper focus on texts in the early, right? Especially the first couple centuries in the study of religion, right? Where now at least we have some more material religion. So there's also those sorts of interventions, right? So I do think that at least in the American Academy of Religion, there's some good interventions, but I mean, I'm in the study of Islam unit, and I can tell you that we still have pretty serious problems in terms of that kind of self-critical piece, right? So I'm agreeing with everybody, also saying there's some nice interventions out there. You can find them like J.C. Smith, Gregory Chopin, and there's others that have had those critical pieces about how, right, India and how other places in the East are studied.
Yep. Thank you.
I have a question for Sophia, and I have a comment, but I'll ask my question first. So what is your practicing tradition, Sophia, if I may ask?
So I am a convert to Islam. My husband is Indonesian, but I became Muslim before I was married to him.
Okay.
But I'm pretty critical. I mean, if you look at my work, like I have a whole book on, Islamic feminism. So it's not like I'm not able to be critical of a tradition, right?
No,
I've gotten into trouble, right, with other Muslim scholars for that, right? So we can be religious and critical at the same time. It's not that hard.
So, the comment that I had is you brought up the name of Richard King, and I'm very familiar with his work, So there's another very interesting trend, which is fairly mainstream in academia at this point in time, which is that deconstruction is used, in almost exactly the same way in which some of us used deconstruction today, by looking at genealogy of thought, the emergence of a particular trend in thought, and so on and so forth, based in Western Indology. But ultimately what happens is that it comes back, to undermine the Indian tradition. Like, let's say, for instance, Richard King, I will, in terms of, his conclusions that he's drawing, I will be able to substantiate some of the very things, which James Mill has been saying about Hinduism, So there's, Hari, I mean, the point that I want to make is that it's not that everybody is using deconstruction, to basically emancipate the Indian tradition from Western Indology. A lot of people, particularly Western scholars, are using deconstruction to undermine the Indian tradition, towards the end. And this is a particular nuance which we Indians will have to notice, because that's another trend in academia. So, so coming back to what I was telling you, that I do not really feel that Richard King or people who write in his lineage can actually move on to emancipate, Hinduism and Buddhism from the clutches of Western Indology. In my understanding, there are two things that are extremely important, for the emancipation of our traditions, with under the hands of this hegemony that we experience, which is Western scholarship on the Indian tradition. One is a critical understanding of Western scholars of their own cosmology. That's number one. Projections, they are talking about, when they talk about Orientalism and Romanticism and so on and so forth, that is there. And the third point here is that they will need to understand the cosmology of our own tradition. There is a particular cosmology on which Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and many other traditions are actually built. And that effort, I do not see in Western academia at all. So, in my understanding and in my assessment, I think, Western academia, by and large, and in fact, the most emancipated of Western scholars, have actually a lot of ground to cover. A critical self-reflexivity of their own tradition and their own lens, transforming and transmuting them and getting into the very core of the Indian cosmology or the Hindu cosmology is very, very important. Like, let's say, for instance, in a brief talk, the point that I was making is that this entire, dichotomous or faulty divide which has been created in, between Hinduism and Buddhism is nothing but falsehood. In fact, what is considered Hinduism, or let's say, if we can represent Hinduism, for lack of going into details, by Vedantic traditions, there is only one difference between what you will call, between Hinduism and Buddhism. That is in terms of the ultimate reality. In all other terms, there are many, many similarities, and those similarities are actually not spoken about. Ultimately, the only distinction or the only difference that comes about is whether, there is something called an ultimate reality or not. And this is, the only issue on which the Hindus and the Buddhists have actually differed. In all other terms, I would say that, Buddhism is just one sect, of, or a collection of many sects of the tradition which is called Sanatana. That's how I will look at it. And that is why, in this brief talk, I emphasize that you have to look into the larger context, in which Buddhism actually emerged. And when you look at that context, there aren't too many dissimilarities between what is considered Hinduism and Buddhism.
Yeah. All right. So I think we can wind up now. I see, yeah. Dr. Nagaraj, do you want to say anything? Shall we wind up?
There is nothing that I want to say. We can.
Thank you. Thank you all speakers. Thank you, Meg. Thank you, Kundanji. Thank you, Sophia. Thank you, Rajat, Manish, Nagaraj Garu, Conrad. Thank you all. Thank you, Ian Vade. Thank you, everybody, for.
Thanks for the opportunity.